The anteroom to the Queen's receiving chamber was not a place where women entered unannounced. It was not a place where women entered at all, unless they were peerage wives come to pay their respects, or ladies-in-waiting, who had been appointed to stand in a particular shaft of candlelight and look pleasant. It was a room designed by men who had measured their world in title and bloodline, and found it satisfactory. On the morning of the 19th of October, in the year of our Lord 1815, Eleanor Cresswell walked through its door as if she had done so every day of her life. She had not. She had spent the previous 9 years doing things considerably more difficult. The footman announced her by her title, which was not the title anyone in that room expected to hear. The words hung in the candlelit air like smoke that would not clear. The Queen's physician. The room did not stop speaking all at once, but it slowed, the way a flock of birds will quiet when something changes and the light faces turned. Eleanor did not accommodate those faces by pausing or by adjusting her posture, or by allowing any visible awareness of the attention to appear in her expression. She carried a small leather-bound book tucked under her arm, its cover worn, pale at the corners from years of handling. She wore a gown of deep green wool, cut simply, with no ornament at the throat beyond a single cameo brooch. Her dark hair was arranged in a period updo, severe enough to be professional and plain enough to communicate that she had not come to be admired, she had come to work. Dame Ruth Hensley crossed the room to meet her, and the warmth in the older woman's face was the first entirely human thing Eleanor had encountered since stepping down from the carriage. Ruth had written to her in Paris. Ruth had written to her in Lyons and before that in the cold gray autumn of Brussels. Ruth was the reason she had returned at all, and Ruth's hand now closing around hers in brief and private greeting was the only warmth she permitted herself to feel before she composed her expression and turned to face the room. She saw Lady Constance Ashmore before Lady Constance saw her. Or rather, she saw the precise moment when Lady Constance Ashmore, Dowager Countess of Dunmere, registered who had just been announced, the fan in the older woman's hand stilled, the small muscle at her jaw compressed. Then, with the practiced fluency of a woman who had spent 50 years managing public appearances, Lady Constance recovered her expression and brought herself forward. "Miss Cresswell," she said. Eleanor let the deliberate diminution settle without comment. She had not been Miss Cresswell for 11 years. She had been Lady Ashmore for 2 of them, and herself again by her own restoration after the separation papers had been signed, and she did not particularly mind being addressed in whichever form Lady Constance found most useful to her case. "My lady," Eleanor said, inclining her head by precisely the degree the social arithmetic of the moment required. Lady Constance's gaze traveled over her with the comprehensive coolness of a woman conducting an inventory. "I was not aware you had returned to England," she said. "I was not aware I required your awareness," Eleanor said, still pleasantly, and turned to accept introduction to the other figures Ruth was bringing forward. She heard Lady Constance speak to someone at her elbow, a murmured exchange conducted in the practiced undertone of women who know their voices carry and intend them to. "The Baron Countess," Lady Constance said. "One wondered what had become of her. One sees that France has made her bold." The woman she spoke to made a small sound that was neither agreement nor contradiction. Eleanor heard it clearly. She did not turn. She pressed the worn corner of the leather-bound herbal briefly with her thumb, and let the familiar texture of it settle her. It had begun, as such things usually begin, in a room she had had no power to leave. 9 years earlier, Eleanor had been 22 years old and 8 weeks recovered from the stillbirth of a daughter, her second such loss in 3 years of marriage. The solicitor had sat across from her in the morning room at Dunmere Hall, and had not met her eyes while he read the relevant sections of the separation deed. The entail required a male heir. The continuation of the earldom required a male heir. The Dowager Countess of Dunmere had determined, with the assistance of the family's legal counsel, that the marriage had reached the conclusion of its practical utility. Frederick Ashmore, Earl of Dunmere, had sat in the chair by the window, and had not spoken. She had looked at him across the room, with the composed and hollow clarity that comes to a person who has been surprised by nothing and devastated by everything. She had known the deed was coming. Lady Constance had not been subtle in the preceding months. The visits from the solicitor, the quiet removal of Eleanor's personal correspondence from the writing desk in the library, the pointed exclusion from decisions that had previously been brought to her, all of it a kind of preparation that Eleanor had watched with the peculiar detachment of a woman who understood perfectly well what was being prepared. She had not wept. She did not weep now. Sitting in the morning room while the solicitor concluded his reading and set the papers on the table between them. She had looked at Frederick, and Frederick had looked at the window, and she had understood the fullest meaning of the word abandoned. She had signed the papers. She had taken her personal effects, which included the leather-bound herbal her father had given her at 17, and she had accepted the carriage that was offered. And she had left Dunmere Hall before the early November dark came down. Lady Constance had watched her go from the front step. Eleanor had not looked back. The months that followed were months she did not speak of in public, and rarely revisited even in private, because they contained a quality of specific suffering that did not benefit from detailed examination. There was the carriage ride north through November, fields going gray in the early dusk. There was the cousin's house in Lincolnshire, which smelled of candle wax and old wool, and the cousin herself, a mild and decent woman named Charlotte, who had the wisdom not to ask questions and the decency to keep her husband from asking them either. There was the particular blankness of the first winter when Eleanor had risen each morning and dressed and eaten breakfast, and done the small necessary tasks of a guest in a small house and gone to bed again and considered, with a strange calm detachment, what she was going to do. What she had was her father's herbal, a modest sum from her own family's settlement that Lady Constance had not known existed, and a knowledge of plant medicine that she had cultivated privately since the age of 15. She had studied it as a gentlewoman's accomplishment and then as something more serious, quietly, in the margins of the life she had been expected to lead. The knowledge had seemed, until now, to have no practical application. It had simply been the thing she loved most, and had never been permitted to say so. She had gone first to a maternal cousin in Lincolnshire, and from there with the assistance of that cousin's husband to Paris, where an introduction to Dr. Armand Voss had changed the architecture of everything. Voss had been 71 years old and had no use for social convention. He was famous in 4 countries for his work in the treatment of febrile illness and the management of women's conditions that most physicians were too embarrassed to study in any serious way. He had agreed to educate Eleanor because she had come to him with 3 precise clinical questions that he could not immediately answer, and he had spent his professional life surrounded by people who either could not ask precise questions or did not bother. He was not particularly kind, but he was entirely fair, which was a more useful quality in an educator. Over 7 years in his service, first as student, and then as junior physician, and finally as colleague, Eleanor had become someone she had not known she was working toward. A woman whose judgment in a clinical matter was worth trusting. The recommendation to Queen Adelaide had come through Dr. Voss's London correspondent, a senior physician named Dr. Ree. George Harwick, who had attended the Queen through a difficult winter illness, and who had spoken of Eleanor's particular skill with respiratory conditions after reading her published monograph on the treatment of catarrhal fever. The Queen had read the monograph herself. The Queen, who was 53, and not in the habit of letting men tell her what was advisable for her health, had expressed a wish to meet Miss Cresswell. The meeting had taken place in August, and by September the appointment was confirmed. Eleanor had not returned to England for him. She had returned because the Queen had asked her to come, and because the work was real, and because she had spent 9 years becoming someone for whom the work was the thing that mattered most. She told herself these truths on the crossing, and she believed them, and she continued believing them, right up to the moment, 3 weeks into her appointment, when the Earl of Dunmere arrived at the Queen's levee. She was speaking with Dame Ruth at the edge of the receiving room when he came through the door. She did not hear his name announced. She simply became aware, in the way the body registers something before the mind has processed it, that something in the room had altered. The temperature did not change, the light did not change. The quality of her own breathing changed. She felt it first in her throat, that tightening awareness before she had turned to look. Frederick Ashmore was 36 years old, and 9 years had changed him in the way that 9 years of unresolved guilt will change a man. He was still tall. He was still broad-shouldered in the way she remembered, filling the fitted lines of a dark blue tailcoat with the unconscious authority of a man who had been dressed by good tailors his whole life. The ease had gone out of him, though. There was a gravity about the set of his mouth that had not been there at 27. His dark hair had not gone gray, though it was cut shorter than it had been, and his eyes, when they found her across the room, were the same color she remembered, that particular gray-blue that caught the candlelight differently than other eyes, and they did not look away. Eleanor looked away first. She had not come here to be undone. Sir Henry Palliser appeared at her elbow not 30 seconds later, which suggested he had been waiting. He was a round, self-satisfied man in his mid-50s, who had been the Queen's preferred physician before Eleanor's appointment, and who had handled the displacement with the grace of a man accustomed to being right about everything. "Miss Cresswell," he said, touching her name with the same precision Lady Constance had used. "I wonder if your Parisian methods extend to the treatment of gout. His Lordship Dunmere has been suffering from it these past 2 seasons. Perhaps you might offer him a consultation." He smiled. "I understand you and the Earl are already somewhat acquainted." Eleanor was composing a reply of measured courtesy when Frederick stepped between them. He had crossed the room without visible hurry, and arrived at her side with a quietness she had forgotten he possessed. "Palliser," he said, and there was nothing particular in the word, no elevation or sharpness, just the flat, declarative authority of a man who expected to be heard. "I believe the Marquis of Holt was looking for you." Palliser glanced between them and withdrew. Eleanor did not thank Frederick. The warmth rising in her face was unwelcome, and she managed it by keeping very still. He was standing close enough that she could see the fine thread count of his cravat and the small, irregular scar at his collar where a horse had thrown him at 17 and left a mark she had once traced with her thumb in an entirely different life. "Eleanor," he said. Her name in his voice was a thing that happened to her physically, a shortening in the chest, a pulse she became involuntarily aware of. She had not heard him say it in 9 years. "My lord," she said. He did not say anything else. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize, something between recognition and something rawer than recognition. And then Dame Ruth was at her side, with the Queen's secretary, and the moment dissolved. She carried the awareness of him through the rest of the levee like a stone in her shoe. It was not that she still loved him. She did not permit herself to examine whether she still loved him. It was simply that her body had not been informed of the 9 years, and was conducting itself with appalling honesty. If you have ever kept a door closed for 9 years because opening it seemed inadvisable, you will understand something of what Eleanor managed across the remainder of that evening. You may leave a thought in the comments about whether she was right to keep it closed, and I will say only this: she had earned that closed door. Stay with her now, because what comes next will cost her again before it resolves. The levee concluded at 10:30. Eleanor accepted her shawl from the footman and walked the long corridor back to her rooms, with a composure she did not entirely feel. And when she reached her door, she stood for a moment with her hand on the cold brass handle and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. 10 days later, she was in the Queen's small household anteroom when the girl was brought in. She was a kitchen servant 14 years old with a fever that had been managed badly for a week and had now progressed to the point where her breathing was audible from the door. Eleanor had been summoned by one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting who had encountered the girl on the service stairs and had the good sense to find someone with medical training before finding someone with an opinion. Eleanor went directly to the child without pausing to change out of her day clothes or to request any of the usual formalities. She drew up a chair beside the makeshift bed and began her assessment with the quiet and complete attention she brought to every patient, speaking to the girl in a low voice to orient her, asking questions the girl could answer with a nod, warming the stethoscope in her palm before placing it against the thin cotton of the girl's shift. She was not aware of anyone else in the room until she rose to consult her herbal for the preparation she intended to compound. Frederick was standing in the doorway. He had come, he said afterward, to return a document to the Queen's secretary. He had heard voices and looked through the open door. What he saw he did not try to describe, though Eleanor later understood from the quality of his silence on the subject that it had done something to him. He saw her sit beside a girl who was frightened and in pain, and speak to her as though her comfort were the most important thing in the room. He saw her warm a metal instrument in her palm before using it. He saw her ask a question, and wait for the full answer, and ask another, and consider both of them before she moved. He saw her write the preparation instruction in her small, precise hand, and read it over twice before she passed it to the woman waiting at the door. He saw her return to the girl's side and stay. He had been the Earl of Dunmere for 9 years. He had employed physicians. He had been present when his mother's physicians attended, and when the family's retained surgeon attended the tenants of the Dunmere estate. He had seen medicine practiced as a performance of authority. What he was watching through that door was something else entirely. She became aware of him only after she had already finished the examination and was writing the instruction to the kitchen for the preparation of the compound. And his face, when she finally looked at it, contained an expression she had never seen there before. It was not the expression of a man who felt sympathy for a sick child. It was the expression of a man seeing something clearly for what might be the first time. She did not acknowledge him then. She gave her written instruction to the woman who had brought the girl in, and she sat with the child until the girl's breathing had steadied enough to allow for rest, and she folded her hands in her lap and remained very still. He left the doorway without speaking. He had been there. He had seen. The library at the Queen's London House was not a private room in any meaningful sense, but at 7 in the morning it was reliably empty, except for the woman who used it to write correspondence before the household woke. Eleanor sat at the writing desk beside the tall window, the leather-bound herbal open beside her case notes, the winter light coming in pale and level off the frozen garden. When she heard the door, she did not look up immediately. The footstep was too deliberate, the pause before it too considered, and she knew before she turned who was standing in the room. Frederick stood at the near edge of the carpet with his hat in his hands. He had come before his valet had fully attended to him, which was an unusual concession from a man who had never in their marriage permitted himself to be seen unprepared. The set of his jaw was the jaw she remembered carved and tense, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he had not slept. He said, "I did not know how to prevent it." Eleanor set down her pen. She did not speak. "My mother had arranged everything before I understood what was being arranged." He stopped. He looked at the carpet between them rather than at her. "By the time I understood, the solicitor had already drafted the deed, and she had made it plain that refusal would carry consequences she had prepared for. She had prepared documentation that would have been damaging to you in a different way." He stopped again. "I do not offer this as justification. I know it is not justification." Eleanor watched him. She had rehearsed versions of this moment over 7 years in France, usually late at night, when her defenses were lowest and her imagination least disciplined. In those rehearsals she had said many things. She had been in those rehearsals, eloquent and precise, and appropriately devastating. She found that in the actual moment she felt principally tired. "Frederick," she said. His name in her own voice was unfamiliar. She had not said it aloud in 9 years. He looked up. "I do not doubt," she said carefully, "that you believed you had no choice. People in your position frequently believe that, because the machinery of their world is very good at persuading them of it. Eleanor, what I can tell you is that there is a girl in the anteroom upstairs who will recover because someone sat with her until she did. I am going to continue doing that work. Whatever you carry from 9 years ago, I ask that you carry it somewhere other than this room." She heard what that cost him in the quality of his silence. She had not intended cruelty. She had intended accuracy. He took 2 steps toward her, and she did not move. and the space between them was very small, and he reached out and let his hand come almost to hers, where it rested on the edge of the writing desk, and then he stopped. His hand hung there, a half-inch from her fingers, not touching. "I wanted you to know," he said, his voice lower than it had been, stripped of its earlier formality, "that it was not a failure of desire. It was a failure of courage. I want you to understand the difference." She understood the difference. She pressed her fingers against the worn leather cover of the herbal and said nothing. He left. She sat for a long time in the pale winter light, not writing. The attack came, as such attacks always come, at the moment of maximum exposure. It was the 18th of November, and Eleanor had been the Queen's physician for 8 weeks. She was crossing the Queen's antechamber toward the receiving rooms when Lady Constance appeared, and Lady Constance was not alone. Sir Henry Palliser was at her right hand, and at her left was the Countess of Shroffham, who functioned in the Tun as a kind of mobile record-keeper of other women's failings. 3 footmen and a pair of ladies-in-waiting had paused in the antechamber at various pretextual tasks, and the room had that quality of deliberate occupation that meant everyone had been assembled in advance. "Miss Cresswell," Lady Constance said. Her fan was open. She held it at exactly the height she always held it when she felt entirely confident of her position. "There is a matter of some delicacy that requires addressing." Eleanor stopped. Her hands were at her sides. "It has been reported," Lady Constance said with the careful diction of a woman who has rehearsed this, "that your treatment of the kitchen girl involved an unsupervised visit of some hours' duration in circumstances that several members of the household found irregular." "The girl had a febrile infection of the lungs," Eleanor said. "She required monitored care." "Several members of the household have also raised questions," Sir Henry said, stepping into the space Lady Constance's pause had opened, "about the qualifications of a woman trained abroad, under a foreign physician, without proper English registration. The Queen's health is not a matter where irregularity can be permitted." Miss Cresswell's appointment was confirmed by the Queen herself. Dame Ruth said from the far side of the room, her voice carrying the specific quality of a woman who has been quiet long enough. "The Queen," Lady Constance said in the tone of a woman managing a minor complication, "was perhaps not fully informed at the time of the appointment of the nature of Miss Cresswell's personal history." She looked at Eleanor. "A woman dismissed from her marriage for the inability to produce children is not generally considered a reliable medical authority on the health of others. The Baron Countess may have learned to compound tinctures in France. One must still consider the judgment of those who trusted her before and were disappointed." The Countess of Shroffham nodded with the specific murmur of someone delivering the 3rd verse of a song they know well. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned, in 9 years of practice, that the moment to speak in defense of one's competence is not the moment one's accuser has chosen for the performance. She waited. Sir Henry continued. The substance of it was a proposal that Eleanor's cases be reviewed by a committee, that her treatments be subject to approval, that her access to the Queen be supervised. It was dressed as concern. It was an eviction notice. She heard what she had been waiting for that evening, from Dame Ruth, in a low voice. Frederick had been in the antechamber when his mother arrived. He had been standing near the door. He had listened and had not moved, and had not spoken. He had left the room before Lady Constance had finished. Eleanor received this information the way she received any difficult clinical finding, with a still face and a careful attention that gave nothing away. She thanked Ruth and said she required an early night, and retired to the small room that had been appointed to her at the end of the household corridor. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady. They were always steady. She had trained them to be. She thought about the morning room at Dunmere Hall 9 years ago, and the quality of Frederick's silence then. And she thought about the antechamber, and the quality of his silence now, and she noted, with the clinical clarity she applied to everything, that they were the same silence. The first had cost her a marriage and 9 years of Europe. She did not intend to let this one cost her the work she had built in their place. She opened the leather-bound herbal on her knee and did not read it. only held it. And after a while she set it on the table beside the bed, and lay down, fully dressed, and looked at the ceiling of a room that was hers by royal appointment, and not by any man's goodwill. Eleanor held very still with that information, and let it do what it needed to do to her, and when it had finished, she put on her evening gown and went to write her case notes, and did not cry, because she had taught herself long ago that the only productive response to being abandoned was to continue working. The Queen's formal winter reception fell on the 24th of November, and it was the largest gathering the royal household would produce before Christmas. Every significant family in London attended. The receiving rooms blazed with candlelight. The orchestra played from the gallery above the main hall. Eleanor was present because her position required her to be present, and she stood near the window. In her best gown, a deep blue silk she had purchased in Paris 3 years ago, and which she had not yet had occasion to wear in England, and she made conversation with Dame Ruth, and accepted a glass of wine she did not drink, and watched the room. Lady Constance entered at 8:30. She had the Countess of Shroffham at her left, and a young woman in pale pink, who was rumored to be the Earl of Dunmere's potential new countess, at her right. She moved through the room with the perfect confidence of a woman who has prepared the ground thoroughly and expects to find it clear. She found Eleanor first. She crossed to her with deliberate unhurry. "Miss Cresswell," she began. "Lady Constance," Eleanor said. "The Queen has been advised," Lady Constance said, and her voice had the quiet certainty of a woman whose information is reliable, "that the committee's concerns have merit. I would not be surprised if you received notice of that review before the week is concluded." "I wonder," said a voice behind Eleanor, "if I might speak?" The room did not fall silent all at once. In the immediate radius around them, it did. Frederick had crossed the room with the same quiet directness she had observed at the levee, and he was standing now between Eleanor and his mother, which required him to have placed himself at Eleanor's side, and the fact of his physical position communicated something. Before he had spoken a word, Lady Constance's fan stilled. "I have withheld my account of certain events for 9 years, Frederick said. He spoke clearly, but without volume, the way men speak when they know they will be heard. Several people had turned. More were turning. "I should not have withheld it." "I intend to correct that, Frederick," Lady Constance said. "The separation of my marriage to Miss Cresswell was arranged by the family solicitor at my mother's direction, while I was occupied with estate matters. I had been specifically misdirected toward. I was presented with the completed deed and informed that its terms were the most charitable available to all parties. I was 27 and had not yet learned to question my mother's legal interpretations." He paused. The pause was measured and deliberate, and gave the room time to understand what it had just heard. "That is my error, and I will not diminish it. What I can do now is name it for what it was." Lady Constance said, "You cannot intend to do this in public." "She is my wife," Frederick said, his voice still level, still quiet, carrying entirely. "And she was always worthy." 12 words. 11. One counted with the precision of the Regency marriage market, which would have noted that the word "she" had been anticipated and subtracted from the formal count. 12 words, or 11. And in the space they occupied, the receiving room found itself in a condition that was very quiet. Lady Constance's fan opened and closed. The motion was not intentional. The young woman in pink had taken a small step back. The Countess of Shroffham was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating. Dame Ruth, from across the room, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. Eleanor looked at Frederick. He was looking at her. Not at the room, not at his mother, not at the young woman in pink, or the Countess of Shroffham, or any of the 40-odd people who had just heard him speak. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her across the anteroom 9 years ago before the papers, and the carriage, and the November dark, in the first year of their marriage when she had not yet learned to distrust what she saw in his face. The expression was the same. She had been wrong to distrust it then. She had perhaps been forgivable in the distrusting. The Queen's secretary appeared at the edge of the group and spoke quietly to Dame Ruth and then to Eleanor. The Queen wished to see her. Eleanor excused herself with the composure that 9 years of French medical practice had given her, and she did not look back, though she felt the awareness of him at her back, like the warmth from a hearth she had not expected to find. The committee's concerns were formally reviewed by the Queen the following morning, and found to be without merit. Sir Henry Palliser's proposal for supervised oversight was returned to him with a note in Dame Ruth's handwriting that was brief and conclusive. Lady Constance did not attend the next 3 royal functions. The young woman in pink was observed at a subsequent evening to have developed an understanding with a younger son of the Duke of Northwall, which was considered a satisfactory resolution by most of the ton, and by the young woman in particular. Eleanor continued her work. Frederick called at the Queen's household on the 26th of November, which was 2 days after the reception, and asked if Miss Cresswell would receive him. Eleanor was in the middle of compiling 3 weeks of case notes, and she set down her pen and looked at the message for a long moment before writing her reply. He came that afternoon. The receiving room that Dame Ruth had arranged for the meeting was a small sitting room on the ground floor with a fire that someone had built up to an unnecessary height and 2 chairs arranged at an angle that suggested conversation without demanding it. Eleanor sat in one of them. Frederick sat in the other. He had brought nothing with him except himself, and he sat without the hat-in-hand's uncertainty of the library, and with a different quality of stillness, something resolved. "I sent you money," he said after a silence that had been comfortable in the way that silences between people who have known each other very well can be comfortable even after 9 years. "I know," Eleanor said. "I did not take it. I know you did not. It would have felt like a justification of what had been done." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "I understood that when it was returned. I sent it again 2 years later. I wanted there to be something that was mine in your life." Eleanor looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and considered that sentence. "There was," she said carefully. "There is." She turned the leather-bound herbal on the table beside her chair, and he recognized it. She saw him recognize it. He had given it to her at their first anniversary, not understanding what she already knew about plants and preparation. He had simply found it in a bookseller's in London and thought she would value it. She had valued it beyond any reasonable proportion of its cost. "Eleanor," he said. "I am not the same woman you separated from," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly. I know it, and I do not know," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to him in the entirety of this return. "Whether what I am now is something you know how to be married to?" He looked at her with the gray-blue eyes that the candlelight picked out. Just as she remembered. "I don't," he said. "I expect I would need to learn." She was quiet for a while. Outside the sitting-room window, the late November afternoon was resolving itself into early dark, and the first flakes of what would become a proper snowfall were beginning to catch the light from the street lamps. She thought about the morning room at Dunmere Hall. She thought about the antechamber at the Queen's house and the girl with the labored breathing who was well now, and had sent her a small note of thanks via the housekeeper. She thought about 7 years in France, and the smell of Dr. Voss's study, and the particular quality of satisfaction that came from knowing how to do something difficult and doing it well. She had not come back to England for him. And yet here she was, in this room, and the snow was beginning. "You would need to learn a great deal," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached out, and he reached out, and their hands met on the arm of the chair between them, his fingers closing over hers with a careful tentative warmth. Not a claim, not a command, but a question. She did not answer it in words. She turned her hand in his, so that their fingers lay together, and she looked at the fire, and outside the window the snow had begun properly, the flakes coming down thick and unhurried, and the room held them both in its firelit quiet. They remained that way while the snow continued outside and the fire burned lower in the grate. And when the footman knocked to announce that Dame Ruth wished to know if Miss Cresswell required a lamp, Eleanor said yes, and Frederick stayed until the lamp was lit, and then a little longer than that. She was the Queen's physician. She was 31 years old, and she had walked across Europe and learned to compound preparations that had saved people who would not have lived otherwise, and written a monograph that a queen had read and found credible. She had been made so by 9 years and by her own hands and by a leather-bound, herbal-worn pail at the corners from use. On the first day of December, the snow was still on the ground, and the Earl of Dunmere sent a note requesting a formal meeting with his solicitor present and hers. The note was written in Frederick's own hand, which was careful and precise, not the hand of a man who found writing easy. Eleanor read it twice. She found nothing in it she could object to, and several things she found she had not expected. He was proposing a restoration, not a new arrangement. He was not asking her to leave her position. He was not asking her to return to Dunmere Hall, though. He mentioned that the estate would be available to her whenever she wished to visit, in whatever capacity she found comfortable. What he was asking, set plainly in 5 careful sentences, was whether she would permit him to try. Eleanor replied that she would attend. She carried the herbal with her to the meeting, not as a talisman, simply because she carried it everywhere now, and she set it on the table while the terms were discussed, and when the terms were agreed, she picked it up again and tucked it under her arm and walked out of the room with the same composure she had brought to every room she had entered since. October. In the corridor outside, she paused. Frederick fell into step beside her without invitation, which was the kind of presumption she had once found irritating, and now found merely familiar. They walked as far as the door. Outside, the street was quiet in the way that streets are quiet when snow has muffled them. A single lamp threw its light across the white-dusted cobblestones in a long, warm stripe. She did not invite him to stay. She did not send him away. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold air on her face and the lamp's warmth at her back, and after a moment Frederick said very quietly, "Thank you for coming." Nothing more. It was, she thought, precisely the right number of words. That evening she sat in the chair by the fire in the small sitting room and opened the herbal to the page she had annotated most, a page on the properties of Yarrow that she had found wrong in 3 particulars and had corrected in her own small, precise hand over the years, and she read it by the light of the lamp. And outside the window, the snow fell quietly over the city, and the fire was warm at her side, and the herbal lay open in her hands, and Eleanor Cresswell was in the fullest sense of the phrase, exactly where she had chosen to be.